Peace and love, family. Welcome to another powerful read book club discussion. Tonight we are discussing chapter 5 of They Were Her Property by Stephanie E. Jones Rogers, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. I am your host, Dr. Ma'at, and I have a panel full of powerful people, but I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves to you.
Hey family, how you doing? This is Brother Brother T Wolo. Definitely happy to join us back this Sunday to discuss chapter 5. Looking forward to hear what the panel have to say about this chapter.
Hi, I'm Marcia Pender. I am a mother of 3. I also have my own homeschool where I homeschool my children throughout the duration of all their years of schooling. And I also help other parents homeschool their children locally. I also have some of them actually within my own home to do some of their schooling as well. So I just can't wait to hear everybody's thoughts on this particular chapter because it's a heavy one.
Mm-hmm. I'm Tam Pender. I'm a product of Sister Marzia Pender's homeschooling. I am a writer, filmmaker, and director.
She sounds muffled and a little far away.
Okay, yeah, I can re-say that. My name is Tam Pender. I'm 17 years old. I am a product of Marcia's homeschooling, and I am a filmmaker / director and writer.
Beautiful. And Brother T, you didn't mention that not only are you the co-host for the R.E.A.D book club discussions, but you didn't talk about JT Coins. And JT Coins is blowing up everywhere on social media. I mean, literally, he has like videos with 1 million views. So could you talk to us briefly about JT Coins?
Thanks, Dr. Ma'at. Always my sister helping me push my product. I appreciate it. On YouTube, Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, I go by JT Coin Rings, where I turn coins into rings, wearable jewelry. I've been doing it for about 3 to 4 years. It's a home business that I started in the hopes to be with my child more. So I didn't want to go out and work a part-time job. So I created this hobby into a profitable business, which the tax man proved yesterday when I paid him that fee. So I have the YouTube channel, as Dr. Ma'at stated. I just hit close to 12.6 thousand subscribers and 1.7 million views. Facebook, 16,000 followers, and I'm growing steadily on TikTok and Instagram. So it just proved that we can make it by doing anything. And the coin rings is just me turning coins into rings for wearable art. So that's what I do here on YouTube. But my most enjoyable task is being a co-host to the R.E.A.D book club.
Ashe. And I always look forward to your perspective. When you join, man, like just building with you every because I know you always say you break it down great, and I'm looking at you like, no, bro, you break it down, because you'll catch things that I didn't catch, or you explain them in a way that I couldn't explain it, and so I just think that you're definitely the yin to my yang, and I appreciate you, bro. I appreciate you, and I'm so happy to see that like you said, something that started off as a hobby, turn into something that you could earn money from, something that you could monetize in order, like you said, to instead of going out here working a part-time job, now I have more time to be with my family. And so I just definitely applaud you for that. Family, take a moment out to share this discussion. Let's get the views up, family. Share this discussion. I posted all over social media what time we were going to go live today at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, family. So make sure that you help me get the word out. Okay. If you're on Facebook, post the link. If you're on Twitter, tweet the link. And if you're on other social media platforms, shoot the link out. Let them know what we're talking about tonight. Okay. And that's chapter 5 of the book, They Were Her Property. And you don't need the book or have read the chapter to even to join in the discussion, to participate. Okay. Because this is something that we know happened during the era of enslavement, right? We knew that the breasts of Black women were being utilized, right? And we know the bodies of Black women were being monetized, abused, violated. We know that. And I just feel like Dr. Rogers in this chapter, she's just coming with the receipts, from newspaper articles, magazine clippings, court records. So she's just giving us, the receipts. But we knew that this happened. during the era of enslavement. But another conversation, I would argue that is happening now, but that's a different conversation. That's a different conversation. Okay. But anyway, make sure that you let's get the views up, share the video, family, and also thumb up the video. I see Rock City, New York is in the building. Peace to you, beloved. Thank you so much for joining. I see our brother CJ Young is in the building. Thank you so much, CJ Young. He says peace and love. I see blockchain. I love blockchain. Blockchain revolution, bridging multiple divides, says peace and power. So thank you so much, blockchain revolution, for joining us. I see Sister Donette Mitchell is in the building. She said, greetings from Cali. I didn't know you was in Cali, Queen. What part of Cali are you in? I got family in Oakland. Tell me where you at in Cali. All right, but see, Sister Donette Mitchell's in the building. Peace and love to you, beloved. Becky Brown is in the building. She says, hey, y'all, the Queen Mother, a beautiful mind, is in the building. She says, peace and love to everyone. And then we got Bars and Chains Network is in the building, says peace to the panel, salute. And we see that David's in the building. Peace to you, David. David said, peace, family. All right, so before we get started, I do have one quick announcement. And I'm waiting for this window to show. All right, here we go. All right, family. So don't forget, Mother's Day is coming up. Mother's Day is coming up. And I am so happy that you see this queen right here, Sister Marjorie Nicole. This sister, I love her vision, and I love her commitment to teaching, our history, our culture, celebrating our history and our culture, and this sister had the vision because her mom just transitioned last March. And so she said, you know what, on Mother's Day, Mother's Day was rough for her, of course, last year, and which is to be expected, right? Like she said, it was hard. And she said what she realized is that it's probably hard for everybody, right? Who's lost a mother figure in their life, whether it's your mom, whether it's your auntie, whether it's your grandma, right? And so what she decided to do was to coordinate and host a Mother's Day lunch, okay, called MOM, Missing Our Moms, right? Missing our moms, our grandmothers, and our aunties. It's going to be a beautiful brunch, family. Beautiful brunch. We're going to put up a shrine. We're going to create a huge shrine. I'm talking about with candles and flowers. And we're going to ask people to come with a picture of your mother, put it on the shrine, your mother's favorite candy, your mother's favorite flower. So we're going to create this massive shrine, okay, honoring our mothers. And we're going to pour libation. And we're going to call out the name of all of the mothers, the aunties, the grandmothers. We're going to call out their names, and we're all going to celebrate together. Like I'm going to be there with my family. We're all going to celebrate, together. Okay. And it's going to be a celebratory moment. I want you to think we may cry, we may laugh, we're going to dance. It's going to be a DJ, huge buffet. Okay. It says general admission is $75. VIP tickets is $100 for reserved seating. Okay. It's going to be at St. Matthew's Church, located at 5401 Lock Raven Boulevard, Baltimore, Maryland, 21239. For more information, please contact or email. Okay. INSA. I'm trying to look at this screen instead of looking at this screen. Hold on. The email address is INSA, NSAA creation @gmail.com. So her email address is right there. I don't know if y'all can see my little mouse moving, but that is her email address. Tickets are on sale right now, family. So if you're in the DMV area, make sure that you come out. It's going to be a phenomenal event. Like I said, we got a DJ, and it's going to be female centered. I ain't going to lie. I want to let the brothers know. We want the brothers to come. We want to let the brothers to come. We want the brothers to come. But I'm just letting you know it's going to be a lot of that motherly, that maternal energy, which we all need on Mother's Day, is going to be in the building. So my brothers, come on out and get loved on. And I'm talking about my brothers who your mother's past, or your grandmother's, your auntie's past. Come on and feel that maternal energy, family. Okay. On Mother's Day, come feel it, because it's going to be a lot of women there who are going to nurture you. We're going to love on you. Come on out. So to all my fellas, I don't want you looking at the flyer like this look like some girl power type of stuff. It's going to be female. When I say female centered, the females are going to be running and orchestrating this thing, because we really want that maternal energy to come through. We want it to be strong. Okay. So make sure, fellas, that you're also in the building. All right. And so anyway, Brother T, let me get rid of this. And I have a request. Remember, I asked you, I said, Brother T, I have a request for you. But I said, I'm going to ask you live. I ask you usually to start it off. And what I want you to do is read that last paragraph of the Are We on the Same Wave? I want you, but while you're reading it, I want to put this picture up because you know how they say a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? Put this picture up. And I just want us to look at this picture and listen to Brother T read the last paragraph of this chapter. Brother T, you have the floor.
Dr. Ma'at, you read my mind. The last paragraph on page 122. Let me start here because I had something else highlighted. But whether they recognize it or not, white Southern mothers were ultimately responsible for the ordeals that many enslaved wet nurses endured in and out of slavery, the slave market. These women decided wet nurses endured and now the slave market, I'm sorry. These women describe when enslaved wet nurses would best serve them and their children. And only they knew the motives underlying these decisions. White mothers determined whether they could withstand the physical toll of breastfeeding imposed upon them and whether they would be able to produce an adequate supply of milk to feed their newborns. Consequently, they were the ones who decided whether to borrow, hire, or buy an enslaved wet nurse. Even if a man might finalize the transaction in the slave market, some men did not influence their wives' decision to change other women with nursing their children. But the politics of respectability that shaped white Southern culture and domestic relations ensured that few men would dare violate white women's bodies in order to determine whether they were concocting reasons not to nurse, especially those of elite and planter classes. Physicians, husbands, and other men had to take women at their word and allow them to make maternal decisions for themselves. Now, this is the kicker, guys. I want y'all to pay attention. White women separated enslaved mothers from their children and placed their own infants at the breast of these women. They compelled enslaved women to suckle their white children shortly after the mothers had lost their own. They denied enslaved women the right to publicly express their grief. In short, they perpetrated acts of maternal violence against these enslaved mothers, and slave market made this violence possible.
So, Brother T, let me ask you this. How did you feel? Like, why did, because you said I read your mind. What made, so when you read that, what was going through your mind when you read, just that when you read the chapter, but also when you read that paragraph to say, daggone, like this is something that we need to actually read,
Let me paint this picture, the slight picture. Give me the grace of 1 to 3 minutes. Elizabeth Cathy Stanton, the Seneca Falls Convention, July 19th, 1848. We read in this chapter from 1800 to the 1860s. All this atrocity happened when white women made an agency of the Black woman's reproductive system. In July 19th, 1848, in Seneca Falls, who was also there? Frederick Douglass. White women wanted to talk about voting, owning property, and having control of their income. Not one bullet point of women's rights cared about the Black woman at all. This was before through women's suffrage programs. This is way before it. So in 1848, not one white woman stood up for the black woman. So the black woman haven't been protected by no one. Her children have been used, sold. She's been sold, not just for her work. And I wrote here, our ancestors were more than just nannies. White women created an agency of using enslaved ancestors' reproductive organs. The agency consisted of a recruiter, a worker. You want to talk about the woman in this chapter who found a healthy black woman with child. She was now a recruiter. She used our ancestor as a worker. And then she found a customer. They created agency. So when they hit this 1848 Seneca Convention, voting, owning property, and having control of their income was always number one and paramount. They did not care about the black woman. They did not care about the black man. They did not care about the black child. Fire! 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 Fire!
Sister Marzia, I don't even know what to say after that. I mean, because he's 100% right. That was their priority. They didn't care. And that's why, a lot of the brothers were looking at, sisters saying, you all are going with her. You all want to team up and go rally with her. She's never rallied with you. She's never, ever stood by you. And then some people may bring up, one or two white women that was at a march or something and say, oh, they was right there. It was Miss Susan. And, but they have never as a collective done anything for black women, black men, and black children. They've never done anything. And so that was a beautiful, beautiful summary. Sister Marzia, did you want to jump in?
I will definitely say there's always anomalies in everything. I will always say there probably are some white women very sparingly that might really feel for the cause of like black women, but it's such an anomaly. It's almost not worth mentioning. It's like Candace Owens being the anomaly. I mean, they can find their black person to, but they don't speak for black people. You get what I'm saying? She's so far out there that they can't even really use her, but nonetheless, I think what I wanted to say was this is definitely validating why I teach my own daughters about feminism not necessarily being your mantle. Like, feminism never has benefited black people, but especially black women. It's always sort of been a distraction to pull us away from the actual point and things we needed to be paying attention to. You cannot find, this was going on. Abolitionists were fighting at this time, but I can't find one abolitionist, and I went back and looked, that made maternal violence a part of their mantle as a point of abolition work. It was just about slavery, but this is definitely a cause that I think as a woman, if you were a passive white person, and you didn't think slavery was that bad, but they start talking about the maternal violence that was going on, that should have moved you. That could have been a selling point, a marketing point that abolitionists could have used, but that they didn't care about that. We're just an unprotected class of people, and it goes back as far as now as like we can go. But I do believe that white people, in a sense, their biggest fear is themselves. Like, they want to perpetuate that we're like them, and the things that they fear about us is really what they fear about themselves. We're not like that. They keep fearing that one day we're going to become like them. And that when we do that, because I guess we're so good at what we do, I guess they're going to feel like it's going to be like what they would do times 10 because of what they've done to us. They're just sitting around kind of like, well, we know we wouldn't put up with this. So the moment that they decide to fight back, we better be careful. But yeah, they're their own worst enemy. Like, this chapter was very difficult to read as a mother, because of the maternal violence that was going on. There were many times I've had to just put this down due to my blood pressure because I take medication, so I have to and I can't do it. But I do feel in a way, again, this is just another example, I mean, many other examples as to who the real perpetrators of the evil that continued to keep going was perpetuated through them financing it, through them becoming agents, for them becoming recruiters. They really kept this going because I really don't think, now that I know what I know, I don't think white men could have been able to keep this going.
Come on. And,
on their own.
And you never, and Sister Marzia, you never see that in the movies. Not that I expect them to tell the truth anyway, but when they depict slavery, you would think that this was all orchestrated by white males, and it wasn't. It was orchestrated by white males, white women, white males, white females alike, and the children. Everybody was involved in sustaining and creating and sustaining the system of slavery, the institution of slavery. No, it wasn't just white men. It wasn't, because they kind of always on movies show her in the house with the fan. She's sitting on the porch. The white children are running around. They may have a nanny. They may not have a nanny, right? They're just running around, kind of oblivious. She's there, but they never show how they fully participated in slavery. So the chapter begins with a woman, I may butcher her name, Miss R.E.A.D from Charleston, South Carolina. Charleston was mentioned a whole lot. And you know why Charleston was mentioned a whole lot throughout this book? Because that was one of the ports. As a matter of fact, my ancestors came through Charleston, South Carolina, and migrated from Charleston to Sumter County. We went from Charleston. I actually think it's either west or east. I don't think it's an up or down when you look at the map. But it was in Charleston. A lot of stuff happened in Charleston, South Carolina, even Baltimore. Brother T, when I was reading this chapter, I said, oh, Lord, Baltimore again. Here we go. But Baltimore was a port as well. They used to bring our enslaved ancestors through Baltimore right in the harbor, and they would ship them to places like New Orleans. Okay, so some of those boats will go, and they also used to have jails along Pratt Street. Okay, so I know, but some folks ain't from Baltimore, but Pratt Street is a street like in downtown Baltimore area where the harbor is located, and I know that's like a big attraction. People come, they want to stay by the harbor, but Pratt Street, they used to have jails along Pratt Street. Okay, and this is where, like, when people were coming through, they would leave their enslaved people. They would put them in the jails, and they would go out and have fun, and then they would leave the next day. You know what I mean? So you had jails for enslaved people on Pratt Street, and now there's an area called Power Plant where a lot of partying goes on, a lot of drinking. There's a lot of clubs over there, but that used to be an auction area where they used to auction us off right there. So I understand why Baltimore is mentioned a lot throughout the era of slavery. And then I also want to say this about Baltimore, but Baltimore is also known as Freeport because at one point we had the largest number of free blacks. So I understand completely why Baltimore, aka Tubman City, while whenever there's literature on slavery, we call it Tubman City because Harriet Tubman used to come through a lot, so we call it Tubman City. But I totally understand why we're mentioning literature. But anyway, there was this woman named I want to call her Gerardo so bad, okay, or Gerardo. But it was a white lady who was walking down the street in Charleston, and she came across a sister who had her infant, in her arms, and the infant looked pretty healthy. And so this woman said, oh, she may be available to be a wet nurse because her friend was looking for what they call a wet nurse. Okay. And a wet nurse is a term that they use for enslaved women who could suckle, right? And that's what these white women were looking for, women who could suckle, okay, or women who could breastfeed their children. So they were called wet nurses. And guys, I didn't know that. I never heard of the term wet nurse until I read this book. I was like, oh, that's what they called it. So anyway, wet nurse. And so she ended up approaching the young lady. And the young lady, it was so sad to me, Sister Marzia and Brother T. So she's talking to this young lady who I guess was already owned by a broker of some sort or was working with a broker. And so she explained to her, like, well, yeah, if you want me to, serve as a wet nurse for your friend, I can, but you have to go through my broker basically and hire me, right? Or buy me, right? And I was like, so I'm reading this beginning of the chapter. I said, damn, she didn't even have control over her body. She had to tell this woman, well, you wanted my milk. Yeah, I could serve as a wet nurse for you, but you had to go through this broker or this person in order to hire me or buy me. And so that's how the chapter began. And so, so she begins to get into a lot of stories. She gives a lot of receipts. She talks about how, let me see, it says, talks about the different views of breastfeeding, right? And so, she gets into how, some people don't look at breastfeeding as a skill. Okay. And she said, because people typically, when we talk about skills on the plantation, people automatically think about your blacksmith, right? The ability to cultivate the cash crops, rice, tobacco, sugar, and cotton, right? The ability to plant, right? Plant, cultivate. So you think about those as skills. But she said here, Dr. Rogers argued that breastfeeding is a skill. And so I think, Sister Marzia, I think you would be best qualified to talk about how it is a skill, because you're like, I breastfed all three of my children. And so how in your opinion, does it qualify as a skill?
Well, it qualifies as a skill because, I mean, and it's no shade to any woman, but it's not something everybody can do. It's something that some people's milk supply is affected for a number of reasons. Most of the time, lifestyle, just your own genetics, your ability have been successful before. So if you weren't successful the first time, it's not as common to expect to be as successful the second time either. And it also depends on how much you breastfeed. Breastfeeding on command, and it can be very tiring because, if you're trying to breastfeed your children every hour or every 2 hours, like when do you really sleep? It's based on your nutrition, your stress levels, really play into your milk supply. So for example, for me, the best experience that I had with breastfeeding was with my first child because I had a wealth of support. My mom was like so key because she would watch my oldest for me as I would sleep. And she would honestly put her up to me even while sleeping so that she could nurse just for me to stay asleep. And I was able to breastfeed her for 2 years. And so, and my milk supply was just really good. Like it was never depleted. Now moving to the second child, I was able to breastfeed this one for a year, which was my goal. The 2 years was just icing on the cake, but I was able to only breastfeed for about a year because my stress levels were higher. I had moved out. I was on my own. I was living with my husband. He worked. So I'm by myself, so that sleeping is not as great. Prioritizing eating wasn't as great. And so the stress, and I was going through postpartum depression, which I didn't even know was a thing because I'm just by myself with no support system. So my milk supply was very compromised by that. But breastfeeding is a whole skill. It is practice, it's support system, it is prioritizing your nutrition. What you eat is what your kid eat. Being in tune with yourself and your child because your breast milk facilitates itself based off the need of the child. It's like a whole coding thing. If your kid is sick, your breast know that, and they will give it what it needs to sort of like get well. Like that's just how it works. And so, yes, breastfeeding is a whole skill. I've known many women who didn't want to try, and that's your right. Some women who did try and weren't successful. And then women who can breastfeed their children and a slew of other children. I know women who donate breast milk, like you can have such a great supply. So, but it is a skill, and I can see how it could have been a marketable skill.
Mm-hmm. And what I noticed while I was reading this chapter is that everyone did not agree with, and I'm on page 104, everyone did not agree with enslaved women breastfeeding white children because they were looking at Black women as inferior, subhuman, right? Inferior. And remember, it says at the bottom of page 103, it says by the 19th century, Anglo-Americans had grown increasingly concerned about the power of bodily fluids in a child's ability, right, to imbibe moral and racial essences through the woman's breast milk. So there was a little stigma going around that amongst white folks, I like to say so-called white people, after reading Birth of a Nation and understanding that it's just an invention, it's just like, I just say so-called white people. So, but you know what I mean when I say white folks. But it was a stigma, like, oh my goodness, you're allowing this, enslaved person to feed, to breastfeed your child. But some of these white women didn't care, because they were like, well, look, I'm too ill, I'm too weak to do it. And as Sister Marzia explained it beautifully, some of them couldn't produce enough milk. Some of them were too ill to breastfeed. And they still wanted their child, of course, breastfed. I mean, back then, we talk 1800s. It wasn't like they could just ride to R.E.A.D or Walgreens and get some Similac, right? Right. Get some formula and put it. They couldn't do that. So it was like, I need to feed this child. I can't do it. Let me see if I can hire a wet nurse. And remember, it talked about also in the chapter that not only was enslaved women hired for their breast milk, but it was also poor white females, right? Immigrants, European immigrants, poor whites. But they said this was mainly in the northern market. So you had a southern market and in the northern market, and in the southern market, you had enslaved women who were for sale, right, or for hire, for their breast milk. But in the northern markets, it was the poor whites, poor white females, and European immigrants who were hired for their breast milk. So we weren't the only ones doing it, but in the South, we were the only ones doing it. If you understand what I'm saying, in the southern market. But yeah, it was this stigma. Did anyone want to add to that, or anything from page 104 that anyone wanted to pull out before I moved on?
The propaganda that was passing the traits from the wet nurse didn't just detail having, like, from the bodily fluids. They believed that a certain wet nurse was better than another wet nurse. It was an account pulled by John Van Hook. He was a formerly enslaved man. He claimed that in the part of Georgia where he resided, it was considered a disgrace for a white child to feed the breast of a slave woman, but it was all right if the darky was a free woman. So they thought if the person was enslaved, don't do it. But if the person was free, it would be a better choice to make that person your wet nurse. And as you stated, Dr. Ma'at, it became a marketing solution. That person, depending on the status of that wet nurse, they start putting it in newspapers, as we see on page 105. We start talking about newspapers targeted women who experienced those difficulties with advertisements. So the white women who had difficulties, they found another way to market. They found another way to incentivize, the word I'm trying to say, how they could get more white women to nurture their own children, because women had issues. As we talked about, sickness kept women from nursing their children. So these newspaper articles were put into place. So they started talking about marketing solution. Newspapers target women who experience those difficulties with advertisement, like the one caption, sore or swell Arctic lintiment. The ad proclaimed that mothers no longer were obliged to transfer their infant children to the care of wet nurse if their own breast should be sore or swollen. All that is necessary is to procure some of this Bragg's Arctic liniment to rub on the affected parts, and gently for a few times, and the evil is remedied. So they was really trying to not just push that the bodily fluids past traits that may be unfavorable. They didn't not just say, hey, if you get a free woman to nurture this child, they were saying, you know what, we need white women to be more nurturing. We need women to nurture their own children. So let's create this whole advertisement in order to push that narrative. And I wanted to bring that point because I want to go back to when the women rights. they said they were sick of being home, taking care of the home and taking care of all of the children by themselves. And they wanted to get out to take care of things in their own rights. So they, once again, this narrative of them being home caretakers, taking care of all their children with no help of a wet nurse, because we learned on page 104 that some of these rules and regulations of or the history of wet nurses were hidden, and they use other terms of the market that didn't say wet nurse. So we don't know all the history based off how they use the terminology, but they wanted to create something like the in this advertisement that promoted more white women to get healed of the evil, or remedy the evil, so they can start nursing their own. So this whole image of white women being so fair, white women being the best mothers and home caretakers, is totally false.
Speak your speech. Speak your speech. Speak your speech.
Did you want to get in?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I did actually. What I was gonna say I found interesting in this section was how selective white people, or specifically white women, get when talking about how inferior Black women were to them. But in this instance, they had to somewhat humble themselves and be like, well, I can't produce enough adequate milk for my children, so I need them to do breastfeed for me. And I just thought that was interesting. I have a little section highlighted in my book, and it's on page 104, kind of in the middle. And it reads, if milk carried the racial and moral essence of the lactating mother, and African Americans were morally and biologically inferior beings, what would be the fate of the white children who suckled at the breasts of the enslaved?
Powerful.
That was a come to Jesus moment.
Yeah.
Because if we're not moral people and morality comes through the breast, you got decisions to make. So
Come on.
I think they had to psychologically accept, whether they verbally said it or not. We know these people aren't morally inept, because if we believe that as a mother, and you would still put that woman at the breast of that immoral person, then what does that say about you? So that tells me that that's not true, or else I would assume as a mother that would not be something you would do, even for the life of your child. You would find another way. But the hypocrisy.
Exactly.
Hard to read as I'm not, obviously not a mother. I'm 17, so reading about these atrocities that these mothers go through, as a female, I can sympathize with it and feel that pain in a way, because one day I do hope to be a mother, and knowing that some of these atrocities went down to girls my age as well, like, having to impregnate them so that they could lactate and feed these white children, was just really sickening to me.
Oh, absolutely. And I know that when you said you could empathize with it, we were talking about this. Remember, your mom and I, and we're talking about this backstage. You said you're 17, right? And so remember, there were women in this chapter who were 17 and 19, who some of them were raped and they were impregnated for the purpose of becoming wet nurses, right? For the purposes to monetize their breasts. So they were raped, they were sexually assaulted so that they could, get pregnant, so that someone could monetize this. And so I want to bring you all attention to page 106, when it says right here, historians estimate that women in the Old South, on average, and we're talking about white women, they gave birth to between 5 and 12 living children during their lifetime. Can you imagine having to nurse? You're a Black woman, right? And you have to nurse 5 to 12 children. Sometimes it says, and Dr. Rogers talked about this, sometimes they hire multiple enslaved women. Because remember, like you said, Sister Marzia, your breast may run out of milk. You may not be able to do it on demand. So when hers failed, they went to this one. When hers failed, they went to this one. When hers failed. And a matter of fact, she tells the story of a husband and wife couple who had 2 children, and each child had 2 wet nurses. Each child had 2 wet nurses, for that sole purpose. And so I'm sitting here, when I read that stat at the top of page 106, I said, dang, God, 5 to 12 children. So you know how many Black women were used at that particular time to breastfeed, those 5. And they said on average, now we know that every white woman in the South could not afford. I'm glad Dr. Rogers brought that out. She said everybody couldn't afford, to have to afford the luxury, of hiring a wet nurse. These were mainly some white folks that had a couple of dollars. They were able to do that, but everyone couldn't do that. But just to hear or just to read that on average these women produce 5 to 12 children or birth them, I'm sitting here thinking about all of those wet nurses who had to feed these 5 to 12 children. And so on page 107, she shows us a picture of Mary Kitchian Edwards. It was a formerly enslaved woman who served as a wet nurse. So I just want to say peace be upon her soul. I'm looking at a picture, of this strong Black woman on page 106. 107. I don't know if you all could see her picture, but this is also a sister family who served as a wet nurse, a person that was, charged, a woman who was charged with breastfeeding and caring for, white children. And so, I'm at the top of page 108, and there at the bottom of the first paragraph, it says violence, loss, and separation often characterize the experiences of enslaved mothers who were compelled to serve as wet nurses to their own children. So I was glad that she described what she meant by violence, loss, and separation. So violence, we know, because some women were raped and they were impregnated for the sole purpose of becoming wet nurse, right? And then loss, because sometimes their babies died. I'm talking about Black women now, enslaved Black women. Sometimes their children died, our children, but their children died. And even though their children died, and it may have been something, they gave birth and the child didn't survive, even though that they lost their child, they still had to breastfeed an infant. So can you imagine, Sister Marzia, you give birth to a child that dies, right? And then the milk that was created in your breast. Oh my gosh, this chapter was so heavy, T. I was there. T, I was in the room. I saw all this stuff. I was there. I can't imagine carrying a child, right? Carrying a child for 30 some odd weeks, maybe to 40, but 30 some odd weeks, 38, giving birth, the child dies. My body has produced milk to nurture this child, and I had to take that milk and then give it to an infant that's not mine. So the loss. And then she talked about the separation. So she said violence, loss, and separation often characterize the experiences of enslaved mothers who were compelled to serve as wet nurses to their owners' children. Separation, because even though, so let's say that our child, the children did survive. Now, instead of breastfeeding my child, that breast milk, I'm giving it to this white infant. And now there's a separation between mother and child. In this book, Stephanie Rogers talked about how, mothers were separated from children. They couldn't even nurse and nurture their own children the way they wanted to, because they were busy breastfeeding and nurturing and serving these white children. So there was a separation. There was a divide between. So when I remember Farrakhan said this and people got mad, I got the clip. Farrakhan said, slavery broke up the Black family. And I know a lot of people say, well, we stayed together. There's a lot of these folks online. Throughout all eras, Black people, we stayed together. Our desire, yes, was to stay together. Absolutely. And why did we have that desire? Because the first boats that left out of Africa, we were separated from our families. So we were serious. When we formed families, wherever we were, whether it was in North America or in the Caribbean or in South America, wherever we were, when we established our families, we wanted to keep our families together, Because we look at Cudjoe Lewis. Thank goodness for Zora Neale Hurston when she interviewed him. He longed for his family until he died. So that separation that occurred during the Middle Passage made us we were already communal and family-centered people anyway. But when we got over here, you better believe when we found somebody we wanted to be with, to have children with, that we wanted to stay in it, that we wanted to keep our families together. So the desire was there. But did it actually happen? No, people were sold all the time. And a matter of fact, Dr. Rogers talked about on New Year's Day, how everyone was terrified when New Year's Day came, because that was the big day, I think, particularly in Louisiana, where that's when they got everybody together and they started selling people and hiring people off. So they said, and I remember reading about that, Brother T. I believe I read about this in Narrative of a Slave by Frederick Douglass, where he talked about how during the Christmas holidays, people had fun. They saw their loved ones. But when New Year's was coming around, people were scared because they knew that that's when people were going to get sold off or hired off, And so Stephanie Rogers talks about that. Did anybody want to add anything before I moved on?
I'd like to add, I want the audience to know that white women did not just do this, hire wet nurses because they were unable to because of sickness. It was a vanity metric as well. They didn't want to have saggy breasts based off of breastfeeding. That is on page 105 that they stated that. But I wanted to bring a point up on page from 106 to 107. So as we know that it just wasn't because of sickness that they decided not to nurse their own children. We found out on page 105 that it was based off of a vanity look. They don't want to have the effects of breastfeeding. Then we have to realize about our enslaved ancestors being overworked. They talked about on page 106, the practice of using enslaved women as wet nurses placed increasing psychological demands on them. Enslaved mothers were generally deprived of adequate food and nutrients to support and sustain their own health, much less the 2 or 3 babies, and white mothers dealt with this difficulty as they might any other household problem. So sorry, I butchered that up, but just to say that our ancestors had psychological and physiological stress. The physiological stress was explained on page 107. They had sexual assault along with the psychological effects. One of the wet nurse was impregnated by the slave master, or then she had children. The mistress also had children. Who nursed all the children? Our enslaved ancestor. She nursed the children that came from her bosom, and also the mother. She also the children of the mistress. So Dr. Rogers wanted to point out that the psychological mindset of that wet nurse was affected, knowing that she was great and had to care for the child of the rapist and also his wife. And she was not able to take care of her own children in other incidents because it was a selling point, as we learned, that a good wet nurse is one who has no children. Why? Because the people who bought her services didn't want her to have a psychological attachment to anybody except their child. And on top of this, we look at the fact that if that's the case, they learned to monetize this. They learned to monetize that a wet nurse without any children, was happy. So they created this narrative that, oh, she's not sad that her children has been lost or died or sold. Because remember in other chapters that white women said, you know what, I want this dress. So let's sell off this child. Let's, so they realized it wasn't just because of the health reasons, it was for vanity reasons. And he also realized that, hey, we're not even looking at the mindset of this wet nurse, that her child was lost, her child was sold. We don't care about that, but we want to monetize it by any way we can. So just letting you know that this institution built up over time, and the white mistress and just totally monetize this effort. And that's one thing that I caught from the last couple of pages.
I just wanted to add that two things. One is a really quick point about America, and going back to, I can remember, I think during the Trump administration, they were talking about, the separation of children at the border and how outraged everybody was. And I remembered a lot of people just kept saying, we can't do this. This is not who we are. And I'm like, since when? Since when? We've been separating children since Black folk have come to this country. They perfectly fine separate. This country has been perfectly fine. This government has been perfectly fine separating children from parents. We still have separation of Black children from their families through the prison system, and nobody's outraged about that. So I do want to say, let's make sure that we keep some things in perspective as we try to fight other people's battles. And I'm not saying my heart doesn't go out to it, but I am saying that this is a systemic issue that has been going on for centuries. And if we're going to be outraged about a group of people, let's make sure we keep that same energy for our own. It still happens today. And the second point I wanted to make was about this idea of the breakdown of asking a woman to breastfeed a child, no matter the circumstances, whether she lost her child or she didn't, but this child is going to become at some point her oppressor. Okay? The psychological warfare of that, of asking a woman to do that. And then also not being able at times, because I trust and believe, if it came down to the milk going to the oppressor's child or your child, that your child was not getting fed that day. So then what does that do with the mother and her children? And the warfare on the Black family with that, because you can't tell me that didn't play in the dynamics of how we worked as a family, and this the children and the bond of the mother and her not being present, not being able to mother her children properly. And then look at us today. And I think when we think about that, which is why I try to have a tremendous amount of grace for the Black family today and how it's dysfunctional. It isn't dysfunctional because we made it that way. It's been dysfunctional for centuries, and we are constantly trying to undo it while we still have outside influence to continue to break down our families. So make sure that we keep that in mind. There has been warfare on the Black family since we got here, and we have yet to still completely get it back on track. So let's just keep that in mind. We're not bad people. We're not out here being deadbeats. I know more Black men more present in their children's lives than I don't, even if they're not married to their mother. I see more Black men holding their babies. I see more Black men being active. When I say an active father, I mean changing diapers, feeding that baby. I see tons of white men who don't do that. I see white men who think watching their children is babysitting. You're not babysitting your own child, And so I just want to think about that, because that breastfeeding thing was, I'm like, it's the breakdown of two things. She is feeding a child that's going to be her oppressor one day, or her children's oppressor. And then she's also being forced to neglect her own child. And then what does that do for the dynamic of the family?
Fire! 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 Fire!
I had to drop a bomb for Sister Marzia. She went all the way in just now. Both of y'all did. This is heating up. And then look, we getting ready to get out of here in like 10, 15 minutes. It's heating up, but we getting ready to get out. But here we go, y'all. So let's continue. Let's move on. At the bottom of page 111, it talked, 110. Let me go back to on page 110. The takeaway from me was that midwives were also involved in this, right? It wasn't just slave owning women, right? Or slave holding women who were who were involved in this. The bottom paragraph, I'm sorry, the second to the third, when we're talking about advertisements, that's Sophia. So if you go a couple of sentences down, it says midwives were also involved in this. So, it says midwives were the principal individuals involved in a woman's and infant's care during childbirth in the colonial area in much of the 19th century. And they offered their clients medical advice and passed on pertinent information about child care. So there were some midwives who recommended, wet nurses and things of that nature. On page 111, the takeaway for me was that thousands of ads were placed in the paper for wet nurses. So, and it was everywhere. Just to name a few, it says newspapers published in Alabama, Washington, D.C., Maryland, Virginia, Louisiana, Kentucky, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Florida, Missouri, Mississippi, and Tennessee. It says individuals placed 1,322 advertisements for wet nurses between 1800 and 1865. So this was serious. This was serious business. And when you have thousands of ads, in different states for wet nurses. So this was a thriving business. And on page 112 and 113, again, I'm not going to reiterate what was said regarding New Year's Day, but what I will do is I want to correct myself. I said it happened in Louisiana, but this was in Kentucky, where they had this big New Year's Day event where they would hire out Black folks and sell Black folks. All right. So I'm not going to revisit that, but I'm at the bottom of page 112 where she now talks about how that white women created a sector, okay, of the slave market, okay, in which individuals offered wet nurses for sale. So you know how they always want to portray the slave market as something that was dominated by white males. No, white women actually created a sector of the slave market that they controlled, that they dominated, that was based on the breasts, the suckling abilities of Black women. Okay, so they were thoroughly entrenched in the slave market, in the sale of Black people. And then, Brother T, in the panel, it talked about slave owning firms. There were businesses, companies that were established. Okay, just to name a couple of them. Let me see. It says you had it says men such as Robert Hill and firms like R.M. Montgomery and Company, who also sought out enslaved wet nurses to purchase for their families or for their clients. So you had different companies. It says on 2 separate occasions, Brian Cape and Company. Okay, so you had different companies, slave owning firms that were involved in this. Okay, and then here, family, let me show you on page 112, 113. These are what the ads look like. I don't know if you all can see it really good, but these are what the ads look like that they placed in the newspaper. So this sister came with a lot of good receipts. So moving on to page 114, and we talked about this actually, breastfeeding being a skill, and she dives into that. But she let me backtrack, because I know Brother T like, hold up, wait a minute, you mentioned the advertisement, but you didn't mention this. There were certain terms that they use in those advertisements to convey the quality of the breast milk. They would say it's likely, it's good, it's superior. They would use phrases like that, first rate. They would also talk about the number of children that the woman birthed and the ages and things like that, so that people could gauge the quality of the woman's milk, okay, in these advertisements. And then on page 114, she gets into a discussion on breastfeeding being a skill, and Sister Marzia addressed that earlier. Okay, page 115, we move into more receipts. That's what I have in my margin, where it says white Southerners not only assess enslaved women's level of skill by determining whether or not they possessed previous experience, they also elevated and graded the quality. Yep, I just talked about that, as milk as young, good, and very fine and excellent, and things of that nature. Did anyone want to say anything before I move to page 116? And we almost there, family.
Okay, we're almost there. Before we go any further, I just want to make sure we understand there were no laws present that protected the enslaved woman to be the mother of her own child, The white women exploited this lack of protection. Based off this 109, it states that many laws regarding slavery allowed owners to ignore an enslaved mother's desire to nurse and raise their own children, and white women were among those who took full advantage of the access to the enslaved women's bodies and labor. I just wanted to make sure we had that point, that once again, 1948, this was not put as a bullet point or a choice to fight for Black women. So just let you know that, once again, I always like putting times and place in order. Okay.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you keep reiterating that and emphasizing that they were there. They were participants. They too were participants in it. And you keep saying they weren't trying to fight for you. They were exploiting your condition. White women were literally exploiting the condition of Black people. They had privileges. Look at all of the privileges that Dr. Rogers, talked about. So white women understood that if they owned enslaved people, that there were certain rights and privileges that came along with being a slave owner, right? Certain freedoms that came along with being a slave owner. Okay. So the enslavement of Black people was directly linked to their freedoms, their privileges, their rights. Now look at the other privilege. Now I don't even have, now look at this. You had, what was I getting ready to say? I think I lost my train of thought. I said, another privilege. You didn't even have to breastfeed your own children. That's another privilege. I can keep my breasts intact. They don't have to sag. So white women did a lot. And like you said, brother T, they exploited our breast milk. They made money off of our breasts. They made money off of our wombs, right? Because remember, they made money. They made money. And so, and let me tell you another thing. I was looking at, I believe this is on page, this may have been, I think we're coming up on it. But there was a situation, and we may have already passed it. There was a situation where a white woman hired out, I think somebody was pregnant and or something like that, or she may have just given birth and she couldn't do anything. So she hired her out to a couple who paid for her, and she took that money and then hired like 2 or 3 field hands to go on a sugar plantation, right, to cultivate some sugar while she hired this. So they were bartering and flipping and doing all sorts of stuff. All right. And these are white women that we're talking about, not white men. So for Black women to align themselves with white women, that shows you what Dr. Amos Wilson always talks about. He talked about historical amnesia. You've got to have historical amnesia in order to align yourself with a white woman in this day and age. You got to have historical amnesia, because there's no way in hell that you will be armed with this history and will be that foolish to align yourself with a woman that doesn't give a damn about Black women, Black men, and Black children. All right, I'm at the top of page 116, and it says, this is what you talked about, Sister Marzia. I have it right here. Enslaved wet nurses nurtured white Southern children who would grow up to serve critical roles in the expansion of slavery into the West and Deep South, as well as exponential growth of Southern cotton cultivation on these regions. So like you said, Black women were nurturing their oppressors, people who were to grow up and maintain the system of enslavement that they were already caught up in. All right. And so again, they start talking, she mentions more slave owning firms, Malikan, Primrose, and Company. So they're advertising things. So companies were involved in this. And I said, damn, in my margin, I put breastfeeding before child was born. Oh yeah. So they might have had, yep, Brother T, go ahead, Brother T. This is at the top of page 117. I had that there, but go ahead, Brother T.
I mentioned this earlier. White Southerners and massive. Okay, page 117. I'm on 118. Okay, wet nurse were sold based on their ability to do it, even if they wasn't able to do it yet. So they talked about informed perspective. I think I just wrote that down as a note, Dr. Maad, that wet nurse has a highlighted skill, and a wet nurse was sold based on their ability to do it, even if they wasn't able to do it yet. So I didn't go to a paragraph. Can you find a paragraph?
Yeah. So it was it says at least on one occasion, it's at the bottom, page 116, at least on one occasion, an individual advertised an enslaved woman's ability to serve as a wet nurse before she even began to lactate. It said the advertiser informed prospective hirers that the enslaved woman was used to attending in the house, but that she would also answer as wet nurse in a few weeks, thereby suggesting that she was pregnant and had not yet delivered her child at the time when the ad was placed. And so she goes on to say that very few advertisements mention prices for enslaved and wet nurses. It says, or the wages that they earned when hired. It says, and this omission makes it difficult to really determine whether they were considered more or less valuable than other enslaved laborers. But there were instances that occurred where she could kind of gauge it, right? Like where they would, say, okay, I got a woman and her child for $600, or I got a woman. So they kind of, she's saying that a lot of these advertisements lack, prices, but based on, transactions, they could kind of gauge it. Did Brother T or anybody, did you have anything on page 117 before we move to page 118? No. Page 118, it talks about court records. All right. And it says court records offer additional advice of the respect white Southerners accorded an enslaved woman's ability to nurse. All right. And so when she looked through these court records, some people actually freed the women, right? That some of these wet nurses who served them, some people actually freed them. There was one particular court case at the bottom of page 118 where the woman died and her heirs were supposed to inherit this particular sister. But when the particular sister couldn't breastfeed, they got rid of her. They sold her. Okay. I mean, so that kind of shows you that, being able to breastfeed was something that was valuable to Southerners. Very, very valuable. Did anyone want to add to that before we moved on?
So, sorry. So, a point that I kind of had in thinking of marinating on all this whole chapter and everything was the term of slave master. Now, I don't know if everybody caught this nuance within the book and reading these chapters and stuff, but she switches out the term slave owner and slave master. And to me, that nuance further drives home the point of the term master, meaning you're like the best of the best, or like top tier, great at what you do. And in order to be a slave master, like the atrocities you had to commit in order to be not just a slave owner, but like the top of the top, the best of the best. It's just wild to me. I don't know.
Yeah, I did catch that. That's a good point.
She
Very good
switches those terms. She'll talk about the certain cases of these slaves and be like they're slave owner, and sometimes she'll say they're slave master. But those are only like the worst cases of in these books and chapters.
That's a good point. It's a good point.
Mm-hmm. Very, very, very good point. Brother T, did you want to chime in?
Great point, because you have to look at the difference. Like you said, the slave owner, slave master, put all the things in practice down to the most dangerous atrocities that were given to our ancestors. So that was a great point, because we saw that everyone did and handled this enslaved ancestor differently. So that I'm glad you brought that point up.
Mm-hmm. And absolutely. And on page 119, and we discussed this in depth, where we were talking about, I don't know if it was you, Brother T, or Sister Marzia, where you said how when they advertised and they were trying to sell these wet nurses, they often promoted them as, oh, she's not coming with her child, right? So that she could devote all her energy to your child, to your infant, right? And so that's what's explained on page 120. When we get to, 119. When we get to page 120, this is when Dr. Stephanie Rogers drives home at the top of page 120 that our ancestors indeed dealt with maternal violence. Okay. And so I do want to read this because I think that the first paragraph on page 120 says it all, right? So she says, let me actually start on page 119. Okay. the sell and purchase, wet nurses, and finalize the transaction constituted, she said, an act of maternal violence. She said maternal violence is generally defined as a case in which a mother commits a violent act against her own children. She said, but here I offer another way of defining maternal violence that takes slavery into account. White mothers treated enslaved women's bodies, their labor, and their products of their labor as goods, and in consequence were able to commit violence against these women in their role as mothers that slavery in the slave market made possible. It says, in prioritizing their own infants' nutritional needs over these of their, I'm sorry, guys, let me put this light up. Let me put this light on. You know, Dr. Maya can hardly see anyway. Commit violence against these women in their roles as mothers that slavery in the slave market made possible, and prioritizing their own infants' nutritional needs over those of their wet nurses' children. White mothers separated enslaved mothers from their children, okay, often prevented enslaved women from forming maternal bonds. And we talked about this, paternal bonds with their infants, and providing them with the nutrition they needed, and distanced them from their communities and kinship networks that were integral into their survival. The demand slave owners placed upon enslaved mothers as manual laborers and in wet nurse and as wet nurses gave rise to circumstances that could result not only in psychological but physical. This was Sister Marzia, what you talked about, against these women and their children. Or Brother T, you said it. It says, okay, and that was it. So here she's describing how how this constitutes, right, as maternal violence. And then at the bottom, Brother T, she poses the question, she says, well, what might enable a mother to so easily ignore and neglect to know another mother's grief and pain, with a question mark. When she wrote that, I put in the margins, that's an easy answer, because she looked at them as a commodity, a thing, property. She looked at these people as subhuman, inferior. That's how she was able to not be able to empathize with Black mothers. So white mothers couldn't empathize with Black mothers because they didn't see Black mothers the same as they saw themselves. That's why. So I think her question was rhetorical, but that's what I was thinking when I read it. Does anybody want to talk about page 121? Anything you saw on page 121?
What I saw there is the excuse as well, where they said that British men who bought female captives on the west coast of Africa claimed that these women did not have the same emotional attachments to their children that European women did. And I just find that ridiculous. Black women are some of the most maternal, fiercely protective people that I know. And I think that's just an excuse to kind of like give them a piece to sleep at night. But I also wanted to just drive home that in this chapter, if it was never clear to me before, I used to think that they just saw Black women, Black children, Black people as like animals, they're just like the cows that we bought or whatever. But I think it was like even worse than that, because if you've ever seen a TikTok video or Instagram video, white women will put themselves in jeopardy to be mauled by a pit bull if they think it's a stray and it needs a home. So they are out here trying to protect these animals. So they didn't even see us as that. Like, it was like less than the animals, because where was PETA for Black folk? Like, we needed PETA for Black folk to be out here protecting us, and we just had nothing. There was nothing to protect Black interests in no way. And so when we try to align ourselves, understand that this is who they are. Like, it just is who they are. I cannot tell you that it's never going to be wise. It is never wise when people show you who they are. You try to give them a benefit of the doubt. It is just not in them to do that. And so teaching your children, making sure that even if you have to send your kids to school, that just means it is doubly important to be sure that you are teaching your children the history they are not going to get at school, about the truth of their history and other people's history. It's just not going to happen. So whether you traditionally homeschool, or you send your kid to private school, or you send your kid to wherever, you need to make sure that your children understand their history before they leave home, and they teach them their history to tell them who they are. It's so important, because half this stuff, as educated as I am, I didn't even know till I read the book. So
Fire! 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 Fire!
You heard it, family. You got to teach our babies our history. And when I read all of these atrocities, you know, that were committed against our ancestors in this book, I said, no wonder that they're trying to stop. You know, they're trying to control, like as Baba Amin said, their narrative, their image, and their consciousness. See, white guilt is a thing. And they're like, man, we don't want white children to feel guilty about what happened in the past. And so they're trying their best to omit this history. And so that's why, like you said, Sister Marzia, it is important for us to teach our children our history. Because like I said, right now, they're trying to control the narrative. They're trying to rewrite the narrative. That's what they're trying to do. Okay. They're also
making it illegal.
Absolutely, making it illegal to do so. And so they're trying to rewrite the narrative. They're trying to control their image, and they're also trying to stay in control of their consciousness, right? And so that's what's happening here. And so for those of you who don't know, you watch, oh, Dr. Ma'at, I don't know my history enough to teach it. Well, we have tools, okay? And I'll get to some of those tools later on. There are also programs, okay? There are also programs that teach our history, okay? Baba Baruti has a program. You got the Sister Crystal Denise. You got Sister Marzia. You got me. You got all of us. You have access to us. So I don't want, we cannot see, we can't use ignorance anymore, family, as an excuse. We really can't. I don't know this. That's why I can't teach. You don't know. I remember reading this quote that said, in the age of information, ignorance is an excuse. And that's what I honestly believe. Because if there's something that you truly want to know, you have the ability to know. Just like we had, you see what we have now? You see what we on right now? If I want to know something, nothing's stopping me from looking it up. This cell phone is a computer, Brother T. And it's a mini computer in your back pocket. So if you want to know something, you can. So don't tell me, miss me with so many videos on YouTube, so many platforms that are teaching Black history is ridiculous. So many books, okay? And so anyway, on page 121, and this is the last page that we'll discuss, because you actually read the paragraph on the last page, Brother T, at the beginning of the discussion. So 121 will be the last one that we discuss. She talks about how, you know, they view when mothers would grieve, when enslaved women would grieve, you know, not being able to nurture or suckle their children, something was wrong with you. Because like you said, Brother T, at the beginning, they wanted to paint the picture as if we were always cheerful and glee. So they came up for terms if we were grieving. They would say we had the sulks, or we had some vices. And so these were terms that they would use to describe Black women who were grieving, who may have been upset, you know, about being separated from their children, or maybe grieving the loss of their children, or the maternal violence. I'll just qualify to say the maternal violence that they were experiencing. You know, that took a toll on Black women, you know, psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, physically, emotionally. And so they came up with these terms, you know, to say that something is wrong, right? She has the skulls, okay? Because usually they're chippery, they're cheerful. Oh, she has some vices, okay? As if it wasn't normal to grieve or to feel pain. And so that made me think of a particular doctor. Family, can you put it in the chat? Help Dr. Ma'at out. That made me think of a particular white doctor who came up with a term to describe Black people when we ran away. Like it was like a term to say that something, it was a psychopathology, a term for, I don't know his name. Family, help me out. I was looking and I said, I can't remember the white doctor's name or the term, but it was a white doctor who came up with a term. It was a psychopath. They consider us running away from the plantation, running away. That was a certain psychopathology. Somebody said Cartwright. Was it Cartwright? Tell me the term, Ayoka. Was it Cartwright? It was a white. Oh, I love my chat. I swear I love my chat. Can you tell me the term? What was the term? Ah, Baba, thank you. Let me write it down. Oh my gosh. I wrote it. I said, what was the term? Samuel. I'm writing it down, family. I'm telling you, the Maadi families in the building. Samuel Cartwright. And the name, yep. Drape. Thank you, Baba. Drapetomania. Drapetomania. Yes. Yeah. And so white folks are famous, man, for coming up with these terms. You know, so they must have the skulls. They must have some vices. Or in this case, you know, Cartwright, drapetomania. So they always come up with some terms to try to fit things that and so that's, so when I read this page, that's what I thought about. I said, man, when I read this page, I said, oh man, these white folks, they were doing it back then. The skulls, the vices. So it says white Southerners developed special terminology to describe enslaved people's emotions, terms and phrases intended to render their pain, grief, and trauma and emotional loss invisible. Oh, let me say that again. I got to read that one more time, Brother T. White Southerners developed a special terminology to describe enslaved people's emotions, terms, and phrases intended to render their pain, grief, trauma, and emotional loss invisible. Think about our children today who are traumatized because of their living conditions, because of their environment, because of their families, and they come to school and they act out, right? And instead of trying to deal with the issues, white folks would just say, instead of trying to pinpoint it, the child isn't learning, of course, because the child is contending with a lot of other issues. So you can't expect the child to come to school and be an A student, right? And they're thinking about the stuff that's happening at home. Some of these kids don't know where their parents are. Some of them didn't eat at night. I mean, a lot of stuff, right? And so they show up, they're falling behind. And so they have all these labels, ADHD, learning, so-and-so has a learning disability. So instead of dealing with what's really happening with this child and why he or she isn't involved in learning and stuff like that, they have a learning disability. They have ADHD. They have I'm just making up stuff, Brother T. Hyper something. Like it's always white folks are famous for doing that, right? Coming up with terms and terminology to mask what's really going on. Okay. And that's what I thought about. Family, hold on, let me mute you. Because as always, the echo when you're unmuted and I'm talking. So, family, I just want to thank you all for putting that in the chat. Samuel Cartwright, Drapetomania. Thank you so much, family. Sister Marzia, what did you want to? We're going to get ready to close out. What did you want to add?
I was just going to. Your point is it's just a way to continue to segregate legally, to label us and to be able to separate our children into other areas of the school. So that way their children can be separated to continue to keep getting all the great things that they want them to get into the school system. And I also want to highlight Queen T, who said that we need to add our breast milk to the reparations conversation. Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Absolutely. And shout out to Queen T in the building. Shout out to Queen T in the building. Brother T, did you have any closing words for the listening audience?
This chapter was very important. It had a lot of things that I didn't know, but I'm glad that the author, Dr. Rogers, put them in place. I had a conversation with a friend that's in Thailand right now. She's watching at 6 a.m. in the morning. So this discussion is something that she looked forward to, and is letting you know, family, continue to share this information so we can get it out to more family members so we can understand exactly what we have to fight for and how to fight.
Absolutely, Brother T. I couldn't agree with you more. Family, make sure that you share this discussion. Share this discussion, family. Let's get these views up. Let's get this information out to the people. All right. And the only way we can do that is if you thumb up the video. I want everybody right now. and Sunspot with Omega Sunlight. I appreciate your work. He said, awesome work, Dr. Mod and panel. All right. And so appreciate you all. So if you wanna show us some love, before you get out of here, thumb up the video. Where's your symbol, T? Thumb up the video. Also, family, share this video. If you're on Facebook, post the link. If you're on Twitter, tweet the link. If you're on other social media platforms, make sure you get it up. I want to close out with the Mel Trek episode 3 trailer. Mel Trek, I will be releasing another episode on July the 4th, so-called Independence Day on July the 4th. I will be releasing Mel Trek episode 3, and it's called Mel Trek Exploring the Ma'afa Part 1, The Arrival of the Portuguese. See, they're trying to erase the era of enslavement and colonization. No. We're not going to let that happen. So for the parents who say, well, what tools can I use to teach my child about what our history? Mel Trek is a tool. We're actually getting ready to put a whole curriculum online this summer that you'll be able to access. All right. So I want to close out with this trailer. Family, make sure that you join us back here next week. All right, next week to discuss chapter 6. Brother T, look, we got 3 chapters left, Brother T. 3 chapters, okay? 3 chapters. And I think that, and another thing, family, go back and listen to these discussions in the archives. All right. So if you missed the other discussions, there's a playlist right on my channels, the playlist entitled They Were Her Property, the R.E.A.D Book Club. So if you missed any of these other discussions, family, make sure that you go back and check them out. All right, Brother T, I'm going to close out with this. Peace and Black power, y'all.
There are many films about slavery told through foreign lenses. Now witness the full story from an African perspective. How did slavery in Africa begin? Who were the major players? Who resisted? Learn the answers and much more in Mel Trek, Exploring the Ma'afa, Part 1, The Arrival of the Portuguese.